Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. On September the 4th to 5th, China will host the Group of 20 summit in Hangzhou. As the G20 doesn't have a secretary or an enforcement mechanism, it relies on political will and leadership to make progress on the issues. So what changes will the presidency of China bring this year? At a time of sluggish global growth, how should the G20 transform itself to stimulate growth? Germany will host the next G20 summit. So what does it expect from the G20 Hangzhou summit? To discuss these and other issues, today I'm very happy to be joined here in the exclusive interview by German Ambassador Michelle Claus in Beijing. But first, let's take a look at this.
The key issue expected to dominate September's G20 summit in Hangzhou, China, will be global growth. More specifically, the slowdown in global growth.
Clearly, it's slow growth. I mean, in a word. What basically the world can harm the world much quicker than anything else is very slow growth and unequal growth. And right now, we really are subject to both internally, unequal growth, in the sense that you have widening inequalities, and externally, where you have some countries that are doing very, very well, or pretty well anyway, and some countries where they're almost flatlining.
Whether you're talking about China, the US, Canada, Japan, Germany, France, Britain, you can't really get that expansion of real GDP going unless you have a sense of coordinated policy.
And that's where the G20 comes in. Comprised of the strongest global economies, the group accounts for about 85% of the world's economy and 80% of its trade. It meets every year to discuss and promote global financial stability.
This year, economists like Steve Blitz and Stephen Lieb hope that the summit can fix some key economic issues, especially in this time of uncertainty stemming from China's slowdown to Britain's exit from the European Union, from a likely US interest rate hike to fears of a currency war.
Their wish list for the G20 summit includes coordinated policies to address issues like trade surpluses and trade protectionism, plans to increase fiscal spending, and ways to deal with currency manipulation.
So as an investor, there is no doubt I want to see a commitment to infrastructure, a commitment to fiscal spending, and when it comes to Europe, a willingness to drop this extreme austerity.
Two things really need to happen, which probably won't. The first is coordinated fiscal policy to increase demand in various countries. The second part, which I think is somewhat more doable, but it's doable over years, not one G20 meeting, is to address currency. Either you're going to have to fix them at some level and keep them fixed, or you're going to have to really police and make sure everybody has floating exchange rates.
And both say when the 20 economic powerhouses meet on September 4th and 5th, it needs to be more than lip service. Leaders need to find solutions, agree on them, and then follow through.
Welcome to our program, Your Excellency. What are your expectations for the agenda of the upcoming G20 in Hangzhou?
I am expecting to see a quite successful summit. I think the Chinese presidency has taken up the right issues and made them a priority, and that is the revitalization of the world economy. And all of us know that the world economy these days is not in too good a shape. Like every couple of months, we see the IMF revising downwards the growth expectations. So G20 is a great opportunity to raise these issues and to do something for world economic growth, since you have 80% of the world economy represented on this forum and this summit.
What do you make of the theme of this G20 summit in Hangzhou, like innovation, inclusive interconnectivity, invigoration?
I think these are the right issues. If you talk about how to revitalize economy, it's about probably fighting protectionism, and it's about structural reforms, and it's definitely about innovation, enhancing productivity. And that is at the center of all these ideas and discussions, I think is great news.
Are you prepared for any Chinese surprises on the agenda? You have spoken of the issue of like trade protectionism, and politicians tend to turn to protectionism in times of crisis. What do you think China can do as a host country?
Well, first of all, I don't expect to see any big surprises. I mean, we're in very close contact, have been for months and weeks with the Chinese presidency. We are part of the Troika, because Germany will be the next presidency following China in 2017. And when it comes to fighting protectionism, if you look at the OECD, they have been sounding the alarm bell and saying that protectionism is on the rise worldwide. You see it in Western countries, but you also experience it in countries like China and many other countries around the world. And something has to be done about it. And I think it's in the interest of China, which is the export nation #1, and Germany, which is export nation #2, to do something against protectionism.
Are you suggesting clearly that the EU will or has already launched the anti-dumping investigation against the exports from China of steel products?
Well, this is the discussion right now, because there seems to be a problem of overcapacities which are being exported to Europe and the United States. And that is part of all the problem. And protectionism and overcapacities, I mean, are somewhat interlinked. And that is why these issues have to be dealt with. And G20 obviously is an excellent forum to take up these issues.
In what ways does the global economy need innovation? Innovation is the key word, of course.
Well, how do you produce economic growth? Export doesn't look like it's going to retake worldwide in the near future. Also, consumption, which is the other way of enhancing economic growth, doesn't look that promising right now. So the only remaining possibility is enhancing productivity. Enhancing productivity means going for innovation, and that is exactly what Germany and China are doing. In Germany, the concept, as you know, is called Industry 4.0, which is an abbreviation for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And the Chinese concept of Made in China 2025 is very closely, it's not the same thing, but it's, very close to the German concept and vice versa. So I think that's the way to go, digitization of economy. This is where we can have huge productivity gains in future in order to enhance economic growth.
Do you believe or share the conviction that China has a lot more margin to explore for urbanization, and throughout this process of urbanization, innovation will be used to encourage incubation for the young brilliants?
Yes, definitely. There's a huge potential, because in the last decade, China hasn't made a lot of progress on productivity. That means there is a huge space, for increasing, enhancing productivity. And that is what China also already decided to go down that way in order to enhance economic growth.
Mr. Ambassador, you've been traveling you have been traveling in this country, investigating perhaps possible joint ventures or whatever. What's wrong with the current low level of productivity for the low economy in China? Is it only because of local debts or a lackluster performance by local government officials due to the high-handed crackdown on corruption?
Very difficult for me to see. Probably labor has been quite cheap until very recently in this country. So maybe there was no need to really enhance productivity and to use robotics and all of that. But China is now, since the wages have gone up quite dramatically, is under pressure to do exactly that. And I'm seeing that also local and regional governments that I visit from time to time have started this process and engaged in increasing productivity and using more robotics in modernizing economy and companies.
What is your impression about small and medium-sized enterprises at the local level, most of which, for example, in the more prosperous provinces of Jiangsu and Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong, used to depend on family-based businesses? Today, they have to upgrade the values, and despite the adversity of labor costs, so on and so forth. How do you estimate the dynamics of the non-public sector, particularly those small and medium-sized ones?
Well, I know that the private sector here is extremely dynamic in this country, and I know quite a few private entrepreneurs. And if we compare to SOEs, I think private companies usually do much better. So I think it's also in China's interest to strengthen private entrepreneurship.
I look at the specifics. Now let's come back to examine loggerheads between European Union and China. The European Union refuses to grant China the full-fledged market economic status. That might be a big problem for bilateral negotiations in whatever case. So most of the Chinese would ask whether by the end of this year the recognition would be granted to China anyway, according to the terms of our negotiations when China first entered into the WTO.
A couple of weeks ago, when the Chancellor was here on her visit and held talks with the Chinese leadership, I mean, obviously this was one of the big issues that was being discussed. And the Chancellor was very clear about the German position, and that is that we will honor our legal obligations and live up to our promises. And at the same time, that we would also have to take care of and consider the situation here, which means the overcapacities. And just now, the European Union, and Germany is one of the important members also inside the European Union, are working on a proposal that will try to meet these challenges. So to put it short, I'm quite optimistic that that problem of market economy status will be solved by end of the year. I'm much more optimistic than I was a couple of months ago.
Does that indicate that in the near future the status will be granted to China, should China honor its commitments?
That's what I expect to see.
All right.
But let me tell you, it is a process inside the European Union where you need a qualified majority of member states, which is more than 50%, and you need the consent of the European Parliament. So we will have to find something which honors our legal and political obligations and promises, and on the other hand takes care of the economic situation also between China and the European Union and the issue of overcapacities. We will find a positive way forward which will suit both sides, the European and the Chinese.
Your country, along with other major economies in Europe, joined the AIIB, which is meant to be inclusive, yes, in sharp contrast with the TPP, which even rejects China. So how do you look at the implications of inclusiveness in sustaining the world economy?
Well, I cannot comment on the TPP and whether it's meant to be inclusive or exclusive, but on AIIB, yes, and that's why we chose to join. We think it's a very good project, and I think it's very wise also to make it an inclusive project. And we're very happy with it, and that's the reason why we joined.
Why do you think the host country put this issue of inclusiveness on the table? What are the circumstances against which this theme, this part of the theme, was put on the table? From the European perspective, what's your immediate response?
Well, also ADB is inclusive and the World Bank, so I think it makes a lot of sense to have a concept also for the AIIB which stresses inclusiveness instead of exclusiveness.
Do you smack of geo-economic rivalry between major powers? You spoke of trade protectionism. So don't you think there are tough competitions, and therefore inclusiveness must be taken very seriously, and perhaps even more seriously today?
Well, definitely, but that goes for both sides. I mean, also as far as China is concerned, we see that protectionism is on the rise. I get more and more complaints also from German companies who feel that market access is not improving, but partially even getting worse. So I think that affects all of us, and that's why we feel that fighting protectionism is something that we all should share as a common project.
Protectionism could be a dodgy, an ambiguous word. For example, since our entry into the WTO back in the year 2001, the Chinese government introduced many preferential policies encouraging overseas investment, or FDI, here in the Chinese market. Today, however, the Chinese authorities have done a lot more to level the playing field, namely golden days for the overseas multinationals here in China are over. Therefore, such draconian measures may have caused some grievances and complaints from players like the German companies. Do you think this could somehow justify the Chinese measures?
Well, We're completely open for Chinese investments. There's never been any investment that has been refused from the side of the German government, and we expect China also to go that way. I mean, we know that it takes some more time, but we expect to see some important steps into that direction.
What are the important steps to be taken by the Chinese government?
Like, for example, our car companies here are all being still forced into joint ventures if they want, or even if they don't want. There's the issue of technology transfer, which sometimes is not voluntary. There is the issue of that the service market is still basically closed up for investments, also from our side. So there is room for improvement.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with His Excellency, the German Ambassador to China, Mr. Michel Klaus. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back, sir. Now, the G20 came into being in the wake of the financial crisis in the year 2008. But today, to be honest, most of the economies of the BRICS, or the emerging markets, are losing their momentum, except for India, which is the fastest growing economy. Today, do you think G20 could remain as useful and as important as when it first came into being in the year 2008? Because in those days, many said G8 or G7 was used by the most developed economies. It's no longer as useful as the role that the emerging markets play in shaping the future of the world economy.
Oh, this is absolutely correct, and this is why G20 was founded. And G20 represents 80% of the world economy. So it does have a role to play, and even probably a more and more important role as time goes by and as we see that economic dynamics shift from the West to the East.
But I said, do you think the dialogue between developed countries and developing nations is still as important as before? Since if you look at Brazil, which is mired in economic and political woes, if you look at South Africa, it has its own very big problems. They can no longer assume the leadership on the platform of G20. Do you still believe we should take G20 seriously?
Definitely.
What are your suggestions for getting the ball rolling, since the G20 is serious about the major issues, but it doesn't have its own secretariat? It doesn't have a particular organization to execute the brilliant ideas.
Well, this is true. We have, but still we see that we have more and more task forces, and still more important would be to honor, to implement the decisions that have been taken. And as far as I'm informed, also many of these decisions we took back in 2008 haven't yet been implemented. So maybe it's more a problem of a lack of implementation than of having, governing bodies.
Let's move from emerging markets to the EU itself, following the alleged devastating impact of the Brexit upon the future of the European Union. Do you think you are regrouping, and are you confident about having a united European Union despite the current refugee crisis?
Well, I think everybody was taken by surprise by the outcome of the referendum. Also, the British government, which obviously didn't have a plan B or anything like that, and that's also why they are very hesitant about implementing the Brexit and about sending a letter to Brussels saying that now they would like to start the process of leaving the European Union. And well, that also goes for us. Berlin and Paris and everybody else was surprised as well. And now we have to see how we cope with that situation. And the most important thing would now be to stabilize the political situation. And we see here and there that there is some positive signs, like, for example, public opinion polls in Germany show that importance of EU and positive feelings towards the EU have increased even after Brexit. People have realized that maybe Brexit was a mistake and that Germany doesn't want to go that way, and that goes for other European nations as well.
It's not the UK which was not very happy about the issue of immigration. Yeah. It's that most member states, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe reject immigration, citing cultural clashes and religious clashes as a reason. So do you believe the European Union, despite all the promise and dynamics of its own integration, is still on the verge of disintegration? You look at the rise of a far-right movement, populism, and terrorist attacks as a result. So what do you think of the future of the European Union?
Well, there are two major problems. There's still the problem of the euro crisis, which is not 100% settled. If you look at, for example, at Greece or at Italy, so we still haven't overcome completely the great financial and economic crisis emanating in 2008. And now on top we have this huge migration problem, and nobody knows how that's going to continue. And it does put a lot of strain on the political systems, on the political arena, and the parties and the establishment in the European countries, no doubt about it. And that to different degrees. Some countries have been more affected by political instability, others, like Germany, less.
Here again is the United States, which is lurking behind all the scenarios. What's the progress, if any, across the Atlantic Ocean about the TTIP, kind of a free trade agreement between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, TTIP is an extremely ambitious project, so we're trying to have that implemented, because that will definitely enhance free trade. But at the same time, I see that there's also a lot of political obstacles, so it's far from safe that it's going to be done still this year under this administration. And once this US administration is out of office, it will take some more time for a new administration to settle and to restart the process. We can't do it this year. So it's quite open at this stage.
The next question might be a little bit difficult for you, Mr. Ambassador. In the wake of the arbitral tribunal on July the 12th on the South China Sea, and back to Asia is an important part of the U.S. effort to rebalance China's influence. We see more signs of geopolitical rivalry despite the end of the Cold War back in 1991 with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So how difficult is it for China to bring heads of state together at this defining moment of history?
Well, I don't see the problem. I mean, everybody is coming, and despite geopolitical rivalries that exist, and also in the economic field, there is no problem of bringing all these together.
Journalists tend to look at things with a note of pessimism. That is why we are reviled sometimes.
I know.
And you diplomats tend to give a more rosy picture. But my question is really about the adversity of not only the world economy, but the issue of mutual trust. Do you think G20 will make more contributions in promoting mutual trust? And this is a big question, but you know what I mean. We need a platform. Currently, G20 is just a response mechanism. Can it be transformed into a more useful and more sophisticated institution, so that the leaders could be brought together on a regular basis? For example, next year,
that's what we're already doing.
Will play host to the next G20 summit.
But that's what we are already doing. I mean, if you believe it can be some sort of world government, that is probably something which would be a bit too ambitious, at least right now. And we have bodies, you know, for that, to take care of that, like the United Nations, and so, especially when it comes to security and political and foreign policy issues. But still, I mean, every opportunity to talk about things, and also to talk about issues that are dividing G20 member states. I mean, G20 is a good forum. I mean,
next year, Germany will play host to the G20 summit in Hamburg. What will be the major issues on the agenda? And do you think domestic politics in your country will be a big issue?
Well, rather unlikely. I mean, except for migration will probably be an issue, but it is already now. It's also on the G20 agenda. You know that Germany is especially affected by migration and the flood of refugees coming from the Middle East and Africa, and even countries as far as Afghanistan. But apart from that, I would believe that we would see a great deal of continuity. The world economic problems, the sluggishness of world economic growth won't be done by end of this year. So this is something that will also preoccupy us, and I think we can expect that that will also be an important issue in the German presidency, how to promote economic growth. And as I just lined out, I mean, we're very much in line with what the Chinese presidency is suggesting. So I would believe to see a great deal of continuity from the Chinese presidency to the German presidency. Maybe we would put a bit more of an accent on sustainability, sustainable economic development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for the encouraging messages that you convey to our audiences through this show. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.